It is a pleasure to be here. Um, a long time coming in many ways. I wrote about the DuSable 40 years ago. Actually, two pieces. The first was for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I had attended a conference, mostly what we then called blue bloods. These were white women mostly, who were the daughters of our quote unquote founding fathers, and they were asking, why are Black people here at this conference on historic preservation? They have nothing to do with our history. And there were maybe, I think, 8 Black historic preservationists there, including myself. And we said, we built this country. There would be no historic preservation if not for us. But at any rate, I digress. But I had mentioned the DuSable in that article, and talking about our history and our just sort of integral, connection to the structure, the physical structure, and the financial structures of this country. So, very good. So, special thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today. And also, it gives me great pleasure to speak on behalf of the ancestors who we celebrate, who struggled, and without whom we would not be here. So we begin with a quote from Malcolm X, Black nationalist leader, whose words spoken in 1964 are very relevant to our conversation about reparations today. So he writes, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there." So for us, state and local reparations do not stop the harm. They are compensation for the victims for the harms that they incurred. We view reparations as the compensation. So what is reparations? The program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And special thanks to the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Brooks for setting the stage. Acknowledgement, the culpable party's admission for the atrocity. Admission should include an enumeration of the damages inflicted upon the victims and the advantages appropriated by the culpable party and an agreement to undertake redress. So it requires action, right? Sincerity and action. Redress, acts of restitution, steps taken to heal the wound, monetary payments. I want to say that the admission of responsibility should insulate a reparations plan from adverse judicial review. This is one of the comments that we hear often. This is not going to happen if you're focusing on race, right? But if you're talking about a plan that is undergirded with judicial, that is, what am I trying to say? A plan that is sort of protected from judicial review. This is something that we are advocating. So acts of restitution or redress, which is steps taken to, quote, heal the wound. This is monetary payments. People often say to us, well, it's more than a check. And we say, let's start with that check. Okay? And then we'll talk about the other programs. Let's run that experiment. And then C, this is ARC, A-R-C, the C of ARC, closure. This is perhaps the most controversial aspect of the plan. So it's an agreement by both the victims and the perpetrators that the account is settled. Representatives chosen by members of the aggrieved community can communicate with the culpable party to establish the point at which restitution is adequate for the debt to be paid. So no further claims would be made by the victims unless atrocities were repeated. We reserve the right to come back if atrocities are repeated or if new atrocities are inflicted upon Black Americans since U.S. slavery. So what are the criteria for eligibility? So the first we say is at least one ancestor for the individual must have been enslaved in the United States. One ancestor. Self-identified also individuals as Black on an official document for at least 12 years before the enactment of reparations or the creation of a reparations commission. So you can't wake up tomorrow and say, I'm Black. Once you learn that reparations are a thing, because we know there will be people who will say, well, my great. Okay. 12 years, 12 years. Nor do they include persons living as Black whose ancestors were not enslaved in the United States, or were, right? Anyone who is, not living as Black cannot be part of the community of eligibility. So these are, they probably do have a claim against their country of origin. So, for example, from Nigeria, Ghana, Trinidad, Jamaica, Antigua, yes, you absolutely have a reparations claim, but not to the U.S. government. That claim would be brought to the UK, the United Kingdom. It's interesting, there's an organization called CARICOM that exists to make reparations claims for individuals in the Caribbean. They don't include Black Americans, nor should they. But the reverse is also true. All right. So, 3 phases of atrocities that we want to focus on. People often talk about slavery reparations. We kind of flinch when we hear that term. It's not just slavery. Yes, slavery is a crucible from which all of these ills emitted, were born, but it's much, much more than that. So we also have the Jim Crow era, which I think is an absurd term. Let's call it what it was. 100 years of white terror campaigns. All right? Ongoing atrocities, mass incarceration, police execution of unarmed Black people, sustained credit, housing, and employment discrimination, and the immense Black-white wealth disparity, which we're going to talk about at some length. Black American descendants of U.S. slavery have borne and continue to bear the undue burden of the cumulative effects of all 3 of these phases of the nation's trajectory of racial injustice. So, the bill, right? Who should pay the bill, reparations bill? And that is, who's responsible for the existence of the racial wealth gap? So, the U.S. government is both the culpable and the capable party. When we look at the Civil War, right, as it was grinding to a halt, President Abraham Lincoln approved the Port Royal project with allocations of 40, this is while the war was still happening, right? Black people were receiving 40-acre land grants, and these were Black people who supported the Union, right? Many of them had run away from the plantations where they had been enslaved. The program was formalized on 16th of January, 1865, with General William T. Sherman's Special Field Orders number 15, which designated some 5.3 million acres of land. This land was confiscated from the Confederates along the Atlantic coast, stretching from the South Carolina Sea Islands to the mouth of the St. Johns River in Florida. So it's interesting, many people have reported that an allocation of 400,000 acres was made, but in fact it was 5.3 million acres. We did the math, sort of doing the calculations, looking at those the different districts, and we're talking about 5.3 million acres of land. In fact, 40,000 African American families were settled on these lands. In fact, many people think, well, yeah, Black people got those 40 acres and mule. Some did, for a short period of time. Abraham Lincoln's assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, restores the land to the former Confederates. At the same time, though, the federal government was reneging on its promise to compensate the formerly enslaved population for their years of bondage. In 1862, it enacted the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act gave not 40 acres, but 160 acres to white Americans, including recent European immigrants. And so we're talking now about land that combined land mass was larger than Texas and California combined. This is what white Americans received. Okay? That promise, advantaged white population, was kept. Some 270 million acres of land. So 1.5 million white households were the recipients of this federal enrichment program. Today, that amounts to 30 to 45 million white Americans who are currently reaping the benefits of that government handout. The last land grant from this project to be completed was in 1980 in Alaska. Okay. So this was, a government handout of the highest order. This was the origin of the racial wealth gap. The government made and, the government sustained the racial wealth gap. There are many, many examples of government action and inaction that improve the financial well-being of whites while minimally impacting blacks. So three examples just really quickly. The Chicago race riots, right, of 1919, which resulted in the loss of at least 23 black lives, hundreds of black people sustained serious injuries, over 1,000 black people lost their homes. The federal government did not step in and restore them. The city did not restore them, the state did not restore them. This was a case where, there were eyewitnesses, to the initial causes of the riot. Names were given to the police, and yet justice was not served. Move forward to 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill, disproportionately provided education, home loan, unemployment benefits to white veterans while building the white middle class in the process. Home ownership and a college education became a reality. In fact, Sandy's and my fathers both received the GI Bill for education, not to purchase a business, not to buy a farm, not to buy a house. So to give you some idea of the numbers that we're talking about, 16 million veterans, 14 million of them are white, who received benefits. Less than 500,000 in the entire country, black veterans received benefits, and most of those who did were for education. In the state of Mississippi, in 1 year, so Mississippi had 85,000 black veterans. No, that's right. Mississippi, 85,000 black veterans, men and women. How many do you think received GI Bill benefits? Give me a guess. For housing. How many? 200? 400? 0, hello. 2 out of 85,000. Southern politicians didn't play. All right. So the racial wealth gap, back here to 4. Back and forth we go. So now what we're talking about here is, the value of the racial wealth gap. Now, how high has it, what has it accumulated to at this point, right? So the amount of the bill, we're talking about 40 million eligible recipients at about $470,000 per person, which comes to $16 to $20 trillion. We view the racial wealth gap as the most robust indicator of the cumulative economic effects of white supremacy in the United States. Thanks, continue.
It's my turn?
Yes.
Let me see. Okay, here we go. So one of the things that we're going to say that I think is really provocative in this context is that a true reparations project necessarily must require federal action. And so we make the point here that reparations are not a matter of personal or individual institutional guilt. Black reparations are a matter of national responsibility. The federal government is simultaneously what we refer to as the culpable party, given the origins of the racial wealth gap, but it is also the capable party. It is the only party at this level of government that has the capacity to meet the full bill. So what do we view as the limitations of individual, organizational, state, and local reparations initiatives? What we refer to as piecemeal initiatives. So first of all, they will not satisfactorily provide restitution. Most efforts frequently involve acknowledgement. In some cases, like Evanston, Illinois, there actually has been some form of compensation. But the difficulty is that these forms of compensation are solely inadequate. And in fact, in the Evanston case, the focus on housing is problematic because although home equity is the primary source of wealth for people in the middle of the wealth distribution, we have to recognize that 97% of the wealth in the United States is held by households above the middle, above the median. And so if we focus exclusively on the characteristics of households at the middle, we're going to be excluding a vast amount of wealth that is relevant to the United States experience. More specifically, 1/4 of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, and this is true only for 4% of Black households in the United States. And an additional point that's relevant here, if we look at that upper quarter of the wealth distribution, their primary source of wealth is not in home equity. It's in non-residential real estate, it's in financial assets like stocks and bonds, it's in business ownership, and it is in retirement accounts, which are also linked to the financial market. So the second complaint that we raise is that these are subscale, that it's impossible actually for all states and localities to meet the task of closing the racial wealth gap. Their combined budgets across the United States are $5 trillion, and we've just said that the minimum that's required to eliminate the racial wealth gap is $16 trillion. And finally, they're not systematic. They're incremental efforts that will not accomplish the goal of actually achieving the material conditions for full citizenship for Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. So more specifically, if we think about state and local initiatives, we argue that they are going to necessarily be incomplete, inconsistent, and inequitable. So incomplete, they're not going to meet the task. If we were to look at the state of Illinois itself, with a Black population of about 2 million people, let's take half that population, being very conservative here, half that population as being eligible for reparations. If we take the figure of about $400,000 as the amount that would be due to close the racial wealth gap, and again, that's a very conservative number, the expense to close the racial wealth gap for Illinois' Black residents would be $400 billion, and the state's annual budget is only $55 billion. In what sense are these types of projects inconsistent? Well, they're inconsistent because they're uncoordinated and decentralized. They're essentially a patchwork where there's no attempt to integrate the various kinds of local and state policies and programs together. And finally, they're inequitable because different projects in different locations provide different benefits. So the entire national eligible population is not all going to be receiving the same type of, quotes, reparations projects. There's even variation in who is deemed eligible from location to location for reparations. We're very grateful that the focus in Illinois is on Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, but that is not true in all of these state and local initiatives. And then finally, the last thing that we'd like to say today is that, in fact, we do feel that there are some vital tasks that can be performed at the state and local level. And so we highlight them here. The first is we need an accurate historical record of the atrocities. And so each state and local commission should undertake the task of providing the most accurate historical record of how white supremacy has operated within their domain or district. The second thing is, apart from the question of compensation, Kristen talked about pulling the knife out as a step that precedes healing the wound. And what states and localities can do is pull the knife out with respect to the policies and practices that are in place within their domain that continue to inhibit and damage and potentially destroy the lives of Black people. So we don't call this reparations. We sometimes say maybe you should call it racial equity initiatives, but each state and locality needs to eliminate the practices that are destructive of Black lives. And so that would be the second major task. The third is something that no state or local program has attempted to do, and that is aggressively support an effort to produce a comprehensive national plan for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. That's what we think is a vital step that should be incorporated in the types of reports that are generated at the state and local level, a plan of action for promoting federal reparations, and a set of steps for how the state and localities can proceed to do that. Last comment today. We're extraordinarily pessimistic about the prospects of a reparations plan being adopted by the current United States Congress. Okay. And in fact, we never got into this mission with an expectation that this might necessarily happen in our own lifetimes. And we're kind of old now, so. Yeah. But hopefully it will happen in the lifetimes of many of you who are present today. I want to provide one statement as grounds for optimism. In the year 2000, a survey that was conducted by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popov at the University of Chicago found that 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. That's FOUR in the year 2000. In the year 2024, that percentage had risen to 28%. Which is not a majority, but it is a 7-fold increase. And the question becomes, can we cultivate and nurture that support to reach a point at which congressional action becomes a reality? Yeah.
I wanted to add one last coda. And again, following on the footsteps of Reverend Brooks, in 1800, probably no one thought that slavery would ever end. But there were abolitionists who were putting their lives on the line and doing that work, doing the research, writing letters, raising money, having education campaigns. In 1900, very few people ever thought that women would get the right to vote. But 20 years later, that happened. I was part of the generation of young people who were helping to liberate African and Caribbean countries from the European countries that had colonized and enslaved them. I belong to an organization called the African Liberation Support Committee. And this is when we and people around the world, were fighting for the end of apartheid, which people thought it's a great thing. It's making so many people wealthy. It will never end. So we are part of the cadre of people, and there are many of us, we're on the stage with many of these people today, who are doing that work, providing a blueprint, a map, if you will, so that you all can take those documents that we and others have created and move this mission forward. Thank you.